Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from Kansas City is my friend Nathan Provost, Dr. Nathan Provost. Dr. Nathan, how are you today?
I am very good. And yourself?
I'm well, thank you very much. And we're having this little chat today because Nate recently completed his dissertation. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So tell us about the long, arduous process that turned you into Dr. Nate, and then we'll talk about the dissertation itself, which is going to get into
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, of course. The process itself was a journey. That's the best way I could tell you what it was. It was a lot of struggle. It was hard. It was very, very difficult and time consuming. But the day that successfully defended the dissertation, it was all worth it in that one moment.
Very good. And see, I think you're wise to say like it was the greatest moment of my life because your wife would probably clock you upside the head.
Yeah, that's accurate. That's accurate. I'd put it in my top five moments
Okay,
though.
see, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So now you had written a dissertation on the Overland Campaign, specifically Cold Harbor, and this has been something you've been working on for a long time. You've done some guest posts at ECW about this work. You've posted on your own social media about this work.
Mhm.
So give us the lowdown. What's the dissertation, and what'd you focus on?
Yeah, why don't I'll actually just start with the question that I had from the very beginning, which simply was, do casualties determine victory or defeat? That was the big question I had when I was reading Gordon Ray's Overland Campaign series. I had no plans on writing a dissertation. I had no plans on even really trying to answer that in a written format. I just wanted to know the answer to that question. And Cold Harbor was a battle that I felt like someone could actually measure and determine if it was a victory or a defeat. And then the more I began reading about it, the more I realized I had to look at the tactical, the operational, and the strategic levels of war as I analyzed it, because it's a much more complex and nuanced answer than I wish it could be.
Isn't that always the case?
I know.
So no, and it seems like it would be a pretty straightforward thing. We had this many men killed, this many men wounded, this many men missing. Why is it more nuanced than that?
Well, is something that is interesting, especially in Western military history. We always really focus on the casualties, and that's a good thing. We focus on the individual person. So we're always really focused on how many lives are lost. And I think that's a great aspect of the fact of how we think as a Western society. However, there have been many battles that we, even as Americans, have fought, and we've lost a good number of men, but it was still a victory. D-Day is a wonderful example of this. It was still an American victory. We still held our ground, but nonetheless, we lost a lot of guys doing that. And that was no small sacrifice by any measure. And with Cold Harbor, it falls something under the same category where everyone always talks about June 3rd. I mean, June 3rd, 1864 is this horrendous day for the Union Army. Now, we can look at that and say, how could an assault be made like that? Well, Ulysses S. Grant, Gouverneur Warren, George Meade, they all believed that one more push, the Army of Northern Virginia would break. And they thought June 3rd was the day to do that. Ultimately, it didn't work. Now, as Gordon Ray has already pointed out, it wasn't in 20 minutes, it wasn't in 30 minutes. It was over the course of the entire morning that the Union Army suffered something like 6,000 men. But I was able to break down those casualties, and the entire Battle of Cold Harbor, you could really begin on the 28th of May when the Union Army is already at Totopotomoy Creek and they're beginning to shift down to the old Cold Harbor crossroads. From the 28th of May to the 12th of May, 1864, the Union Army lost roughly 12,216 soldiers. the Army of Northern Virginia, at a bare minimum, lost 6,600 in that same time period. At most, though, they could have lost up to 7,500. They both lost roughly the same ratio or proportionality of men. That's why this is so difficult. We can't look at this and say they won, that Confederate forces won because, the Union Army lost more men, because the reality is the Union Army did not retreat after that engagement. They stayed on the field.
Kind of going back to something you said a second ago, where you talk about casualties as a yardstick for victory or loss. And I immediately started thinking about Franklin. Like, the Confederates say they won the Battle of Franklin, but look at the casualties. Was that really a victory? And so, I think that you raised this great point where, kind of getting below that surface and stop looking at it from an absolute and really look at the sort of the shades of meaning, really kind of gives us some interesting context.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So,
and
oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, and that's, once again, that's where the operational and strategic levels of war play into the fact that we have to look at the bigger picture. I mean, what are the objectives? What are the goals of each army? And are they really achieving or bringing the war to an end after each of these engagements? I mean, that's truly how I had to come and look at this battle.
Now, I thought it was really interesting when you first told me about this project and you were looking at Cold Harbor. And I thought of all the places you could pick, boy, that was a hard road because of everything that goes on in the Overland Campaign up to that. It seems like the numbers are impacted by so many different things before you even get to Cold Harbor.
Yes.
What are some of those challenges you had to navigate as you looked at that?
That's an excellent question. I had to determine the strength of each army before they arrived at Cold Harbor. I had to determine the morale of the men in both the Army of Northern Virginia and within the Army of the Potomac, as well as the Army of the James. That has to be incorporated in, and you have to include those reinforcements that are brought up, the losses that take place at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania are massive. I mean, they're huge. The I will concede that it was outside of my scope to really look at the casualties from those engagements. So I relied on primary sources that ultimately said how many casualties were in each of those engagements. I specifically looked at the engagement of Cold Harbor, and I relied very, very heavily on Alfred Young's work, which is the statistical analysis of the Army of Northern Virginia during the Overland Campaign. And
Which is exactly what it sounds like.
it is, it really is. And oh my gosh, that work, it's very difficult to beat it. But in that work, he goes into an extraordinary amount of depth to explain which regiments are missing casualty counts. And that's why I couldn't find or pinpoint an exact number of Confederate casualties, is they just weren't reported the same way Union casualties were reported. And even with Union casualties, the common number that we rely upon is the days between the 1st of June to June 15th. And that's because it comes from the official records. But we have to get rid of the numbers from Second Petersburg and the movement across the James River. It was very difficult to do.
One of the things that I think too is really challenging is like all those numbers I think come with a big asterisk because I think of Governor K. Warren at his headquarters at Elwood on the Wilderness Battlefield, looking at the returns for the first day, and it's like I can't report these; these are too high. No one will believe these because this is so horrifying. Fudge the numbers. And if Warren's doing that, who else is doing that? And so how badly were the numbers fudged? And that's at the Wilderness. So you still have the Wilderness, you have Spotsy, you have North Dana before you ever get to Totopotomoy Creek, and then
Right. And
whoa.
and that's a reason why I used the morale of Union soldiers. It was qualitative data that could hopefully support the attitudes of Union officers as well as the decisions made at higher levels. And based upon what I read, it was very, very mixed. There were a lot of soldiers that were disgusted by the loss of life. There's no doubt about that. And this is speaking from the Army of the Potomac. Primarily, you're looking at the Second Corps. Okay. But if you're looking at the Sixth Corps, and maybe the name Elijah Hunt Rhodes rings a bell, he actually
you've got to say it in the New England accent though. Elijah Hunt Rhodes. Elijah.
I'm sorry. I don't even want to try, especially being from in the Midwest. I don't
All right,
want
all right,
that.
I'll
Yeah.
give it a pass.
Um but no, he actually on June 4th, the day after the assault, he says, I am all but confident in victory. I know we're going to win. And a lot of soldiers felt that way. And even Abraham Lincoln, he wrote a private letter to one of his cabinet members not long after the Battle of Cold Harbor. I believe it was sometime in June. And within this letter, he said, Grant is exceeding my expectations every single day. And if he wins the war within a year, that will exceed expectations as well.
Wow. And that's a pretty phenomenal statement, considering everyone at the beginning of the war is thinking like, yeah, this will be over in 30 days. And,
Right.
by that point in the war, Lincoln's thinking like, if this only has another year to go, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it goes to show the confidence he had in this new army and as well as in the Corps commanders and Grant. Um, I really do think it speaks volumes. And on the flip side, speaking of the Army of Northern Virginia here, Robert E. Lee is writing many letters to Jefferson Davis and his wife. And quite frankly, it's a bit of doom and gloom. He was very thankful for June 3rd. He said, thank God that we have survived another day. But he wrote a few items indicating that people in Richmond that can't stomach war need to leave now. And it did impress me how he was able to adapt to everything that befell him between the 28th of May to June 3rd, because it looked really bad for the Confederates. The Union Army was winning tactical victory after tactical victory. The Union cavalry was just winning battle after battle. And the cavalry greatly improved since the beginning of the Overland campaign by Cold Harbor, and that showed.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately that qualitative data, I believe, is really supported the decisions made by the officers at the higher level, both in the Army of Northern Virginia and within the Army of the Potomac and Army of the James.
And you talked about that morale issue, and I think that's one thing people forget, that when Grant authorizes that attack on the third, like he had that string of tactical victories that leads up to that, and I think maybe even as he pulls out of North Anna, kind of the lesson he learns, which is maybe the wrong lesson, is that the Confederate morale is so low, and then he has these strings of victory, but in fact Confederate morale isn't as low as he was led to believe.
And that's wishful thinking on Grant's part. And it's an unfortunate aspect of military decision making is there's a very fine line between confidence within the military and overconfidence. And here we actually see overconfidence. Now, we can only imagine Grant possessed only so much knowledge about the Army in Northern Virginia. His only intelligence that he's gathering before the Battle of Cold Harbor is coming from Confederate deserters and civilians living within the area. A lot of times, either runaway slaves or um, pro-Union sentiment. Okay, so the deserters obviously don't have much faith in the Confederate Army, so they're not really going to say that, there's high spirits in the Confederate Army.
Yeah, yeah. If there were, they wouldn't be deserting in the first place, right?
Right. And on top of that, Lee doesn't attack Hancock's Second Corps when they are isolated from the rest of the Union Army. And so that's another aspect of probably why Grant believed they were on their last leg. So is it overconfidence and criticism? Yes. Contextually speaking, it's hard to say what Grant knew at the time. And I also understand why he needed to maintain that level of confidence within the Army. It's just difficult to say.
So he pulls out of North Anna after the Confederates don't launch an attack against him.
That's
Walk
correct.
me through that series of tactical victories that he has over the next few days that you mentioned just a second ago.
Yeah, of course. So after they leave North Anna, one of the most, I think, popular engagements, at least, is the Battle of Hawes Shop. And it's a Union tactical victory where the Union do hold the ground, and the Union cavalry plays a very prominent role in this battle. And Wade Hampton is forced to abandon his position there. However, they do discover where the Union Army is, and they know where to move. The Confederates do, at least. But nonetheless, this is a big deal. I mean, many of the engagements in which they've had, it just seems to be indecisive, or they're just moving parallel to one another. There's not really any ability to press beyond that. Well, the Union Army now is able to position themselves further south. I mean, now we're getting to within just um, 15, 20 miles of Richmond, which to the Union Army, the soldiers, they're like, we haven't been here since 1862. So that was a very big deal. And then, of course, you have some actions around Totopotomoy Creek. You have the Battle of Old Church. You have the engagement on June 1st, in which the Union Army does briefly break through Confederate lines. They did not have enough time to build Confederate breastworks, and therefore the Union soldiers were able to briefly gain a foothold within the Confederate lines. Then, of course, at Bethesda Church, you have part of the Confederate Army launching a very mismanaged attack against the Union Army, and it was really bad. Therefore, there's these, even though they're minor, they're not comparative to the Wilderness or Spotsylvania. It looks very good tactically speaking for the Union.
So they've got this win, this win, this win. The attack that goes on the third was actually supposed to go on the second. A lot of
It
people sort of
was.
forget that too. How does that timing affect the outcome?
Well, this is where I'm very critical of the Union High Command, in which they decide to postpone this attack. Because June 2nd, there's a few items here that should have alarmed the Union High Command. The first is that Hancock's corps is exhausted at this point. They're exhausted, and they hated that march from Totopotomoy Creek all the way down south to the old Cold Harbor Crossroads. And they wrote about that more than the engagement on June 3rd. They hated that march more than any other. So they're exhausted at this point, and they are overused. The Second Corps is very much overused at this point. The
Let me
other
interject real quickly because you think about their attack at the Wilderness and their attack at the Muleshoe and Po River and the Muleshoe, their maneuver down to Bowling Green. I mean, they hung
Right,
out to
they
dry there.
engage at
Yeah.
Totopotomoy Creek briefly. Yeah, they're tired. They're very tired. Um, the other item that should have cautioned the Union officers was there was actually attack made by Confederate forces that day on the 2nd of June against the Ninth Corps and part of the Fifth Corps. And that was around the Shady Grove Road. And the Confederates actually managed to lodge a position within that. The Union forces, there was actually a brief gap in Union forces. Luckily, the Ninth Corps managed to hold on. They brought reinforcements forward, and there's the scene of Burnside. He was ready to get involved, lead soldiers to the front, and take command himself because he just so happened to be at the scene of the fighting that day. I could only imagine that episode.
Maybe
But
it would have been
needless
a
to
chance for redemption. He
it,
gets a
it would
bad
have.
rap. Maybe.
Well, and I like to think Burnside got his redemption at Cold Harbor after the 3rd of June, but they were attacked on the 2nd. So that should have indicated, okay, they still do have some offensive capacity. They do have enough men to launch a minor assault against Union lines. That might say you might want to, they're actually stronger than you think they are. And then, of course, the biggest issue is by not launching the assault on the 2nd of June, you are giving the Confederates time to build breastworks. That is their downfall.
Something the Confederates have a lot of experience in by this point.
Absolutely. And by giving them that extra time, you created a very, very awful situation for yourself the following day. And Meade initially was actually adamant about pushing on June 2nd, but he withdraws that concern for reasons I still don't quite understand. And you can read this in the OR, it's there. But for 1 minute, he's very passionate, and then literally just within probably a couple hours, he changes his mind. And I'm not sure why he did. That's when he goes to Grant and said, I think we need to postpone this assault. My only belief is that Hancock convinced him his men are too exhausted. They just can't do it. So Grant sides with Meade and says, let's postpone the assaults until the next day.
Now, how much do you attribute to the strained communication between Grant and Meade at this point, or the strained relationship that is kind of developing?
Yeah. The I believe that it was initially good between the 28th of May to the 2nd of June. Both acted in their respective roles. Meade acted as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant acted as the general in chief of all armies. He focused strictly on strategy and operations. Meade was focused on tactics. Of course, there was a few instances where Grant got involved, but it doesn't seem as if Meade was too upset about it. And just an example of that was the decision to hold the old Cold Harbor crossroads at all hazards. The order came from Meade, but there's some evidence to indicate that Grant pressed that issue. But for the most part, they acted in their respective roles as both general in chief and commander of the Army of the Potomac. That changes entirely on June 3rd. And June 3rd, based upon the research that I found, changed their relationship forever.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
that's a moment that you would point to.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. Okay. So now Grant, and I'm always fascinated by kind of the story around this line from his memoirs, where he says he ever after regretted that final assault at Cold Harbor. There's so much to unpack with that statement, and when he wrote it and why he wrote it and that sort of thing. What's your take on his statement about regretting that final assault?
I like context and nuance. And within that quote, if you go beyond that quote, He'll say that he also regretted one of the assaults made at Vicksburg. Was Vicksburg a Union defeat? No, I'm not. Trust me, I am not comparing Vicksburg to Cold Harbor here by any measure. Vicksburg was an amazing victory, but nonetheless, any commander could regret an assault, but it doesn't mean they lost the battle. And Grant absolutely could have regretted that assault. There's no doubt about it. It is interesting, and speaking with some of the national park rangers in Richmond, and I'm very grateful of their help and interpretation of events. But one of them in particular actually pointed out to me that Grant actually wrote in the passive tense in his memoirs in that very section, I have always regretted. And that's very unlike Grant's writing. If you know, I'm sure you've read Grant's memoirs, and he uses a lot of direct verbiage, but here we see him writing in the passive tense, and that's very interesting. And this is actually the point going back to Meade. Grant was very, very upset with the way Meade coordinated that battle.
Or didn't coordinate it, as the case
Or
may
did that, and that was the problem. Very briefly speaking, Meade had this idea that Gouverneur Warren and Burnside were making huge gains up around Totopotomoy Creek and Bethesda Church and on the Shady Grove Road, and they were. But Meade believed that they would come swinging down from the north, and they're still miles away. And they would come to support Smith in the center, Baldy Smith in his 18th Corps, as well
most
as
most people most people just need to apologize for Baldy Smith in general, so I don't blame you there.
Right. And it was a very, very bad coordination of the battle because Hancock's attacking it a different time than Smith. Smith is attacking it a different time than Burnside and Warren. It's very disjointed, and Grant ultimately has to get involved, and he personally rides to a couple of corps commanders, asks of the situation. I believe he sent a few of his aides to a couple of other corps commanders. He didn't ride the entire line, but he sent a couple of his aides. They got back. That's when Grant decided to end the assaults. But he did make it so that they would keep the line that they held, which I can get to that in a minute. But ultimately, a lot of the corps commanders were really upset with Meade, William Baldy Smith being one of them. And William Baldy Smith went to Grant at City Point during the Richmond-Petersburg campaign and talked so angrily about Meade's generalship at Cold Harbor. But Grant defended Meade. And William Baldy Smith actually was relieved not too long after this.
Again, Baldy Smith, one of those fascinating characters, but we got to be careful. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing that I've always found fascinating about that quote is, people make it seem like he just skipped over Cold Harbor entirely, and he, kind of whitewashed what happened with a statement of regret. And he's got a few paragraphs in his memoirs about it. But he's dying of throat cancer as he's writing that, by like literally weeks away from death as he writes that, and he pens a note to one of his secretaries that said, "I wish I had more time to write more about this, but I'm dying." And so people, I think, read too much into that. So I think it's really cool that you have really dived into the nitty gritty of it to tease some of this stuff out.
Well, and that's why I rely. Grant said that he always enjoyed Adam Badeau's work. He thought that it was the most accurate. And looking at Cold Harbor, I used a lot of Badeau, but I also used Lee's papers. I went as far as to use John Gordon's recollections of the war.
Oh yes.
And Jubal Early, of all people, wrote some very interesting comments about Cold Harbor. And I actually want to read one of them.
Oh yeah, please do. Please do.
I kept one of them
Yeah, old
um,
Jew.
because I think this defines Grant's generalship after June 3rd, which Julie Jubal Early states that Grant made an invariable practice to cover his front, flank, and rear with a perfect network of entrenchments. And on June 3rd, June 4th, June 6th, June 7th, the Confederates made many attempts to try to find an opening and in Grant's line to see what they could accomplish, and they could not find anywhere to attack him because the network of entrenchments, he contracted his line behind a creek that made it very difficult for Confederate forces to cross. Uh, and then, of course, the networks of trenches along the front were just too difficult to try to penetrate for the Army in Northern Virginia. In fact, Lee made the comment to Davis saying he would risk the entire war trying to make an assault against Grant's army here. He would like to, but it would risk the entire war effort.
Those are pretty high stakes. Those are pretty high
Yeah.
stakes.
Yep.
Yeah. I love what you point out there because again one of the criticisms that is levied against Grant, particularly because of Cold Harbor, is he just liked to do for frontal assaults, frontal assaults, frontal assaults. And here you're talking about like how cautious he is about making sure his flanks are protected. People don't give him credit for a lot of that kind of stuff.
No. Well, and he even created a network of entrenchments for the Fifth Corps to hold as he was pulling out his army from Cold Harbor in the case that the Army in Northern Virginia caught them moving out of their trenches. So he even prepared for that. But this was Grant's specialty, is this type of siege craft and that you see at Vicksburg and in Fort Donelson. But this is what Grant was used to, is fixing his enemy and working his way, feeling the flanks, protecting his own flanks. He people do think of him as an offensive general, but after researching Cold Harbor, I really see that he was actually a much better defensive general than I think he was offensive. That's
Yeah.
just me though.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. All right. So, and I don't know how much you get into this, but of course, after the assaults, there's the controversy about the flag of truce, and what do we do with all these wounded men? What do you make of that controversy?
That made up a very big section
Okay.
of my dissertation, and that came down to not just looking at the correspondence between Grant and Lee, but there was an instance I came across with the Ninth Corps. And just for background, Grant and Lee, after June 3rd, there were many Union casualties between what we would refer to as no man's land, and Union soldiers wanted to try to save the men that were wounded within no man's land, but it was very difficult to pull them into safety. And then, of course, there was a lot of dead they wanted to bury. So Grant initially asks for a ceasefire. It's not really like a flag of truce, but a flag of truce would mean that he was beaten or something to that effect.
Because there's a lot of military protocol involved with this.
Right. Lee really enjoyed this correspondence because to him it was this affirmation that he won, even though they're both still at Cold Harbor. To him it was like, I can get him to agree to a flag of truce, and I'm not going to agree until, he agrees to that. And then the timing of getting the correspondence between each other and between the lines was very difficult. So they couldn't quite come to an agreement on the time. And this was over the course of days. And it was not until June 7th that ultimately they agreed to a time. They came out and identified those bodies. But on June 7th, when that flag of truce was supposed to take place, there is a report from Burnside and from Potter saying Confederate forces are firing upon my men as they are trying to get the wounded. They are breaking the flag of truce. Well, this was something I actually had to email my advisor about and ask him, because I was a little surprised, and I said, okay, so did Jubal Early not get the message that there was a flag of truce? Did he not care that there was a flag of truce? There's no really clear evidence here, but there clearly was a breakdown either of communication or negligence that resulted in that. More
Or Jubal
interesting,
Early just or Jubal Early just being a jerk face,
yeah, I mean, he might have received it and said, nah. That very well could have happened. Um, an order from Lee for Jubal Early is not a definitive. Uh, but but needless to say, there was some firing, and it's difficult to say because what I thought was strange is Robert E. Lee doesn't mention the flag of truce to Jefferson Davis. I mean, at least from his writings or his papers, I couldn't find anything. There wasn't anything in any newspapers about it. And I'm a little bit surprised by that, because you would think that the Confederates would use this flag of truce to their advantage, at least at a political level, by saying they're defeated, they're demanding a flag of truce. But there wasn't really any of that. I think, and it could be in passing, it was mentioned to Davis. It could have, but it wasn't as popular or remembered as well as I thought it would be by Confederate soldiers or war correspondents or anything like that.
I think about the flag of truce that got called in front of Early's lines at Second Fredericksburg, which then gives the Federals the opportunity to break through. So I know he's got a very troubled past when it comes to flags of truce. Now, this is to me a really complicated moment in the whole battle because of the etiquette issues, the military etiquette issues. There is a huge public relations battle that's related to this. Who's going to declare victory? Who's going to declare a loss? Which ties into the political situation of the moment. So it's a fraught discussion.
Right. And I decided I actually would look away from accounts from soldiers, and I actually looked at civilians living in Richmond and what they wrote around this time, just because I was curious. I mean, you have an army sitting 15 miles outside your city gates. I mean, I would be a little concerned. um, as I looked through them, I did find that they were concerned. They did not like the fact that there was this army sitting there not too far out, and some began leaving uh, because it did look so bad uh, for Richmond, especially.
So, this whole episode then takes on this larger than life mythology after the war. Grant loses X number of men in 15 minutes in these charges. Yes, and it seems like every time I hear the story, it goes up by about 5,000, and the time shrinks. So
Yeah,
like in 13 seconds, he lost 5 million guys, like that kind of
yeah.
thing. Why does it take on that sort of importance?
Right. This goes back to one of the main reasons as to why I wrote my dissertation, is it goes back to this whole idea of this lost cause mythology that's created after the war. And it wasn't just, about Grant the Butcher or anything like that. It was this idea that um, it was basically developed in the past due to the economic and social woes of the South at this point and coping with their loss. You have guys like Edward Pollard. Okay. He wrote the Lost Cause, but he also wrote a ton of other works that supported these false notions of that Grant the Butcher myth at Cold Harbor. Um, and he also wrote something like the Southern History of the War, and it described Grant's tactics as hammering and hammering only, which isn't the case. But these ideas continued. They didn't stop, and it was preserved in memory, especially in the United States following the war. And especially with those casualty counts, they increased over time. And you might get a kick out of this, actually. In the Richmond Times, not long after the battle, they said Grant lost 250,000 men in the Overland campaign, 250,000. And I couldn't help but laugh when I saw that. I mean,
Oh, you know what? I think Pinkerton wrote that article. That's he was writing for the
okay,
Confederates by that point.
yeah, and
Probably.
there I saw accounts of 100,000. I've seen, if you read any Southern newspaper about Cold Harbor, it's almost comedy. I mean, it's just, these numbers are huge. Luckily, obviously, even later people kind of realized, okay, well, even that's a little too much. And conservatively speaking, future historians made it a lot less. So even that 7,030 minutes or whatever is a lot less than that 100,000 that was written in the Confederate accounts. But it took some time to figure out those numbers, and that was a big part of this research. And I know Gordon Ray led the charge on that. And again, I have to give him quite a bit of credit for doing so. But ultimately, the attacks, they were supposed to begin at 4:30, 5:30, and they were suspended around noon. So you're really looking at the course of like 6 hours, and they didn't lose 7,000 men during the actual assaults. They lost something like 3,500. And then the rest of the day, they lost like 2,500, something like that.
And it can be deceptive to stand there at the battlefield and look across that field and think like, oh gosh, they lost, these thousands of men in 15 minutes right here, as opposed to kind of thinking in that larger context, what you just mentioned, that it's over the course of the day, across the whole line, those numbers really can be deceiving.
Well,
You gave a shout out. Oh, go ahead.
oh, I was also just going to mention briefly that I'm very thankful to Bobby Crick Jr., who took me and my father out to Edgar Salient there at Cold Harbor, and that was incredible. He explained that this area, there was more casualties here in this one area. I don't remember how large or the scale of it, but over the entire war, I mean, there were so many casualties in this one place. And this is where Hancock's Second Corps broke through briefly on June 3rd, but it was very, very bloody fighting there. And it's also where they started building the mine.
Yeah.
The Union did.
Yeah. People forget about that little episode too,
Yeah,
don't they?
yeah.
So you actually anticipated my previous question. I was going to say that you'd given a shout out to Gordon. I knew that Bobby Crick was very helpful to you, particularly among the staff there. And your advisor, Stephen Woodworth, we should give him a shout out too.
Yeah, no, I actually was just telling someone the other day, um, at this point, he could not respond to any more of my emails the rest of my life, and I'd always be grateful to him. Um, so I'm extremely grateful to all the advice and help with the writing and everything. He let me use some of his documents because he's currently writing a work on the Virginia campaign. He sees the whole thing as one campaign, and I know it'll be a very good work. I know it's in progress. But I'm very thankful to him. In my defense, I was very thankful to you. I mentioned how you gave me the Simon Griffin diary, which was extraordinarily helpful. Reading about the Ninth Corps and the actions of June 2nd and June 6th and June 7th, and it was phenomenal. I mean, it was very interesting. So I'm very thankful. I'm very, very grateful for that. But yeah, there were so many people that really helped me out along the way, in various archives like AHEC and Grant's Presidential Library, and of course the Richmond Battlefield Archives was a huge one that I used. Um, I felt like I was all over the place looking at sources.
So let me kind of, as we head into the home stretch here, I'm called to mind that old quote from Joseph Stalin about the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic.
Mhm,
And you spent a lot of time with this project looking at numbers.
mhm.
But we started out this discussion where you said it's really good that we look at those numbers as people. What was it like for you as a historian, day after day, to really grapple in a hands-on way with the scope of death?
Yeah, it was eye-opening. And I even found out that one of my great great grandfathers actually served in a New York regiment, and he didn't die at Cold Harbor, but he got sick at Cold Harbor and died. He died of illness. And I so there's that personal note there, but reading about the experience of all these men, I don't know how they did it. It sounded horrible. It sounded miserable. And the fact that so many still said at the end of the day, if if we win this, it'll all be worth it. It's amazing to me these guys fight the guys that did manage to survive could go home and live very interesting lives after the war, or go out west, or start a small law firm or business, and that's, I mean, that's their story. It's just very impressive to me because that is something that I'm sure they never forgot about. And it's not like these guys went back to Cold Harbor to have these big celebrations like they do at Gettysburg. There was one anniversary that they came to celebrate and come together for, but it's not like something they would do every year. It's not like a place where they really want to remember. And even if you go to Cold Harbor, it's not decorated by monuments there. There's one monument, and that's it. And I think that speaks volumes to the way these soldiers wanted to remember Cold Harbor. It was a stepping stone to greater victory for the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James, and their victory at Appomattox Courthouse.
Yeah. And you think about the unrelenting nature of what they went through the month before they even get to Cold Harbor.
Mhm.
And I'm always amazed that there are regiments whose enlistments expire while they're at Cold Harbor, and a lot of those guys sign back up, like even after what they've been through. To me, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, and I think that speaks to the cause itself and what they understand to be fighting for. And it differed, but these guys clearly had to finish it out and end the matter. And that's how Grant saw Cold Harbor. It was an operational and strategic Union victory. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, I think the biggest source of evidence is actually Robert E. Lee himself, where on June 12th, I could only imagine what he thought when he looked across that battlefield and saw empty Union trenches, saying, where did they go?
Yeah. After all that, they're not done yet. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So, Nathan, if people want to know more about your work or read more details, how can they do it?
Well, in about a year, Liberty University will publish it to the public. I did that purposefully because I'm actually working it into a book right now. And it's my hope that I can get it published. Um, I'll very, very, I'll say liberally within the next year. can't make any promises to that, but I'm adding in a few more items. I want to talk a bit more about how the Battle of Piedmont affected Cold Harbor. I want to add in some more details about after the June 3rd engagement. But hopefully it's a project in the works for me, and it's something that I really want to see on bookshelves sometime in the future.
Well, I want to see it on bookshelves too. So I wish you the best of luck with that.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me on.
Nate, it's been a delight. Congratulations, Dr. Nathan Provost.
Thank you so much.
I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.